Hi and welcome back to the course. In this video we're going to be writing our items to the database. The first thing to do, however, I wanted to show you something that may become important in the future. And that is the way that Python does the importing. See, when we import a file, or indeed something from a file, Python runs the file. So for example, here we are importing user register from user. So the first thing that Python does is it's going to run the user file and make sure that everything is in order. So it goes to the user file and it creates the class user and the class user register, and it looks through the methods and that sort of stuff. It doesn't actually run the methods, but for example, if we have a full stop there, it will identify that this is not correct. If we never import user, then it would not identify that that's not correct. It wouldn't run the file. So that's the first thing it does. It runs the file through. And if it's got any classes, then it verifies that the class is correct. If it's got any method, it verifies the methods are correct, but it doesn't actually run them. However, if it has a statement, such as a print statement here, print hello, every time we import this file, it runs that statement. And now that's interesting because imagine we have our user.py file here and we've made a lot of code, and at some point we want to import something from app.py. For example, just for the sake of imagination, imagine we want to import app so that we can get the secret key. Okay, not something that we're going to do, but just imagine we have something here that we want to import. All of these things would already exist if we've ran the app.py file. For example, nowadays we do Python app.py and that runs the app.py file. But if we run the user.py file, for example, and that imports app, then on import, we would run the following statements here. Now, that may be okay, because creating a Flask app is not a problem. Creating an API is not a problem. What is a problem, however, is running it. If we import something from app.py and we want the app, then we can import the app and everything is in order. We just create an object of type Flask and then we import it. However, if we import from app, we would always run app.run, which means that on import, we would start our Flask application. And that's not really what we want on an import. So on import, we don't want to do things that we would only want to do when we run the file. So here we only want to run the Flask app if we say Python app.py. If we are importing app, we don't want to run the Flask app because likely is that we don't want to do that. So hopefully this makes a bit of sense. Unfortunately, there is a way that we can prevent the Flask app from running if we were to import something from app. And that is, if name = main, then do that. And I think we've looked at this syntax before. I just wanted to explain that this is why we do this. If we import app, then that creates the Flask app, or if that already exists because Python's already run it, then it just gets the app from there. But if we import, then we would always run app.run, which is not ideal. So this circumvents that because whenever you run a Python file, for example, if we do Python app.py, Python assigns a special name to the file we run. And that name is always __main __. So if we run the app.py file, that is main. If we run the user.py file, then this is main. So only the file that you run is main, and therefore if the name is main, we know that we have run this file, and therefore we want to start the Flask app. If it's not main, then that means that we have imported this file from elsewhere, and therefore we don't want to run the Flask app. Okay, hopefully this all makes sense. Now, leaving that aside, let's go into the post of our item. So I'm going to open item.py, and then we're going to navigate down to the post method, and we're going to implement this. Okay, so sorry for that sort of deviation, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Okay, so the first thing that we've got is something here, which in the post method, which checks if an item already exists. Okay, so we should do that as well when we rewrite the method. This filters through the items list, which no longer exists. Now we need to make sure to check the database to see if an item already exists. So how do we do that? Well, we've got the get method, which does that. However, we cannot call the get method. We cannot say if get name, or rather if self.getName, because self.get requires a JWT token, and the post method does not, so then we would have a bunch of problems. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to extract some code from the get method into a separate method and then use that. So I'm going to create a class method that is going to be find by name, and that's going to be taking CLS and the name, CLS because it's a class method with double S, and the name because that's what we're going to be finding. And the find by name method, all it's going to do is it is going to do all of this stuff there. So it's going to connect to the database, get a cursor, select the item, run the query, fetch a row, close the connection, and then if the row exists, it's going to return the JSON. Now, the get method doesn't have to be duplicated, so instead we can just say that the item is self.findByName with a name, and if item, return item, and if not item, then return not found. So now what we've done is we've extracted the useful code, essentially the code that doesn't deal with returning things. We've extracted that into a separate method, which means that we can now call it from our post method. Instead of if self.get, we say if self.findByName. And I do appreciate that this is a class method and not a sort of self method like post is. But nevertheless, we can still call it using self dot, or we could call it using item dot if you prefer. It doesn't really matter. Either is fine. Okay. So there we go. Now we are able to return that an item with the name already exists if it already exists. Okay. Now let's go below, and what we have to change is this items.append. Now, items.append is only useful if we have a list that we can append to. Now we're going to have to write it to the database. So what to do is, you guessed it. First of all, we connect data.db and we create a cursor. I'm sure you'll remember how to do all this stuff by now. Then we create a query, which is going to be insert into items, the values, question mark, but this is going to be the name and the price. Then we're going to execute the query with the item's name and price. We've defined the item up here, just as we had in the last section, so we're just going to use that item's name and the item's price. Okay. And once we've inserted the item there, all we have to do is close it, well, commit it, and close it. And then we return the item, which is this JSON here. Remember, we cannot return item objects or user objects. We always have to return JSON. And the item here is a piece of JSON data. Okay, so that's our item. Let's go ahead and run this. So the first thing I'm going to do actually is go to the create tables file and remove the test data from there. So don't insert test data anymore. We don't need the test data since we are now able to insert data. Now let's go over to the terminal. For me, this restarts automatically, but if it doesn't, then you can restart it yourself. What I'm going to do is remove the data.db file. You can do that through Atom if you prefer, just right click and remove, or you can do it on the terminal like so, and then run the app again. Now remember, because we've ran the app, that is __main__, so it starts the Flask server. And then let's go over to Postman. And I'm going to close that. And the first thing we have to do, remember, is register, because we don't have any users. So I'm going to register there. And of course, if you delete, apologies, we have deleted data.db, so we also have to create the tables again. My bad. Easy to forget to do that. Just remember that if it tells you SQLite 3 operational error, no such table users, you know that you forgot to create the tables. Okay, let's try that again. We create the user. Then let's go over to auth and sign in rather. Copy the access token. Create a new item, which I'm going to call test. And the item is there created. This endpoint doesn't need the JW token, but just to verify, we are going to get the item out, and indeed it comes out. So now we're able to write data to the database as well, which we already were with the user, but nevertheless just going over through the motions once again. So what we're doing first is we check the items not already in the database, and then we parse the data using the parser, which, as you know, checks for price. We create the JSON of the item, and then we use that to insert into the database. And finally, we return the item there. So there's nothing magical going on here. And in fact, many REST APIs like this one are just this, are what's called CRUD APIs. Create, read, update, delete. That's what this item resource does, essentially. Create, read, update is down here, the put, and delete. And it's really this simple. I'm sure you could go ahead and implement the delete and the put yourselves as well. There's really not much magic going into it, just a couple of SQL statements. And that's it. And if you have stores as well as items, then you would also have a store resource that has these 4 methods. And they're all very similar. You can also get much more complicated APIs, of course, that do other things, like send emails or look for flights, even things like that. But in many cases, you will be creating CRUD APIs like this one, and as you can see, there's no magic going on. It's just a matter of interacting with the database and putting things in it or taking things out. So it's not too complicated. It's just a matter of writing the code to do it, really. But there's nothing difficult inherently in it. Anyway, I hope you feel that way as well, because if not, that would be rather awkward. So if you do think that this is difficult, do ask a question in the course Q&A, because the process for inserting, retrieving data, and the interactions are inherently simple. There's not much going on. So if you think it is, then do ask a question in the course Q&A. I'm always eager to help out. And that's it for this video. So I'll see you in the very next one.